Welcome everyone. I'm Professor Borrowdale. This is Critical Thinking. And to start out with, we have an announcement from the Student Government and OSA about voter registration.
Hi folks. So my name is Mike Jones. I'm the campus organizer here at LCC with the Oregon Student Association and here on behalf of your student government, ASLCC. I'm sure most of you probably guessed by now I'm talking about voter registration. I want to talk to you about how important it is, especially here at Lane Community College. So some of you might know, but the folks who actually set your tuition on campus are the Board of Education, which is a locally elected board. So these are folks like from in and around the community who run for this office. They have the power to do things like set the budget, set tuition, determine which policies, and even what programs are available here at Lane. But more than that, they make a lot of decisions based off of what resources are available from the state, and all of those are determined by, again, elected officials, your representatives, your senators, etc. So it's really important that college demographics, like folks in college who are impacted by a lot of these like top state level decisions, have the ability to actually like select folks that represent their needs and are actually advocating for the things that are going to make them more successful. Especially, like a lot of folks don't know, there's actually a fall special election this year in Oregon. And after a long session like we just got done with, there's a lot of different things that crop up on the ballot. So it's important for folks to keep that in mind. It's not as flashy or as well advertised as some other elections, but it's just as important. It has a lot of like major impacts on the school level and the local level and things that like you all are going to care about at some point or another. So I wanted to put that out there, let folks know that that's happening and why it's so important to be involved. But I know a lot of you are awesome and probably already registered, but I do want to touch on a couple quick reasons folks might need to re-register. So first off, if anyone has moved recently, if you've moved since the last time you voted or the last time you registered to vote, you do need to update your voter registration info. We have a vote by mail system, which is great for a bunch of things, but it does mean you have to update your registration info a little more regularly. Secondly, if you haven't voted in the last couple of years or you just don't remember the last time you voted, odds are you've probably been dropped from the registry and you'll want to re-register. Make sure that you actually get your ballot this November and you can get that sent into the right spot. Thirdly, how many of you all remember the last time you saw a voter registration card? Anybody? A couple of folks? How many of you remember how you signed that card the last time you signed it? My guess is not many folks. So the way that you sign your voter registration card is what they directly compare your ballot to, and if those two signatures don't match up, they actually don't count your ballot. Or they try to get in touch with you in time, and sometimes it doesn't always work out, because we're busy, right? We're going to school, we're working, all that jazz. So you want to make sure that you just know for certain. If you're a little unsure, better safe than sorry to just go ahead and fill out another card. There's no harm in filling out another one if you're unsure. Aside from that, do folks have any quick questions for me? I know I'm talking a mile a minute, but I don't want to eat up too much of y'all's class time. Okay, if folks could open these up real quick, there's some really little details in here that if you missed, you actually won't be registered. So starting at the top, there are two bubbles. If they apply to you and are correct, please fill them out entirely. If you don't fill out those two bubbles, you're not registered to vote. We need your your last and first name, your Oregon residence address, city and zip code, and your date of birth, all of that info. And please put a phone number. If there's anything up with your card or the elections office has any trouble reading something, that's the only way they're going to be able to like reliably get in contact with you to update your card and make sure you get registered. Next, we need either your driver's license or the last four of your social. It's either or, doesn't matter which one, just as long as you have one of those in there. It's okay if you don't have an Oregon driver's license, you can just put your the last four of your social in there. Lastly, signature and today's date. Again, please sign this as the way that you can easily remember and sign your ballot. And please put today's date. These cards have to be turned in 5 days after they're signed. If we don't have a date, they can't verify that, and you might not be registered. Today is 10/3/17 for folks wondering what the date is. Party affiliations over here, it's completely optional. This isn't a primary, so it doesn't matter what your affiliation is. It doesn't affect how you vote, but by all means, feel free to put whatever you like there. If folks don't have any questions, I'm just going to stand quietly over there by the green screen, and if folks could just pass those over to that side of the room when you're done, I do need them all back even if they're blank. Do folks have any last minute questions for me?
So if we signed up last year, it's fine.
So yeah, if you filled one out last year, you haven't moved, haven't changed your name, everything's still the same, you're totally golden. Cool, yeah?
If I don't have my license on me, can I just use my social security?
Yep, absolutely. Good questions, cool. Folks have any other questions for me? All right, thank you so much, Instructor Borrowdale.
Sure.
Appreciate your
No
time,
problem.
and I'll just be over there. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. So one thing I mentioned as you're finished filling those out, for those of you who have them, the Board of Education are the people that signed off on eliminating all religion classes and cutting all philosophy classes except for 2 at Lane here. and offering no more than 2 classes per term. So if you dig philosophy classes, it's, we have a crop of people on the Board of Education that are focused on financial issues and a kind of narrow bean counter mentality to the exclusion of all of their things that are important to students. And so they're sitting on huge reserves. The board directed the administration not to cut into those reserves. And just, said basically, slice and dice, laying programs, make it work. Don't use any of this money that we have sitting in a big pile off to the side. And so you get draconian cuts to programs that are important to students. So there was one board member that voted for a proposal that was supported by students, the classified staff, and faculty together, and the only people that didn't like it was the administration. And instead, the board voted for the administration's proposal, which included expanding some programs, cutting a bunch of other programs, and then hiring some new administrators. So if that seems like a bad outcome to you, think about getting involved in the next election for the Board of Education and putting in people that are going to be friendly to the concerns of students. People that run for the Board of Education usually care about education, but they tend to be from business backgrounds and not necessarily in touch with student needs. They see it as sort of like the Rotary Club, giving back to the community. So they may be well-intentioned, but their priorities aren't always in line with the student priorities. So
there's a whole bunch of seats up in 2019.
That's true,
4
right?
Seats are up for election.
Yeah, so this could make a big difference at the college, and to not just how much money there is, but how that money is spent. Because we have a $219 million budget here at the college. So even though it might be nice to have a little more, that's still a big chunk of change, and it's spent in various ways, and not all of those, I think, in the best interest of students. We have a new president, though, so I'm looking forward to some positive change. Okay, let's get to some critical thinking. Figure out what's going on here with my pen. There we go. Battery might be failing on this. Okay. So last time, and maybe I'll call up my my handout here. We talked a bit about critical thinking and why it's important. Let's stick with this for a minute. Why I think critically. It's a lot of work. So what we talked about this last time. So what's the point of critical thinking? Part of the college mission. It's core learning outcome. Yeah.
To develop an honest worldview.
All right.
Your screen's not on.
Thanks. By the way, if I'm like right on here and gesticulating like this and you see like a blank screen, let me know. So turn that thing on. So why I think critical? An honest worldview. Yeah, I think it's good to not be biased, and certainly not being biased is I think part of critical thinking. It's part of being critical. But then ask the questions that I asked last time. So it's like this sort of idea of I like this honest worldview. Why would you want an honest worldview? Why not just like a pleasant worldview? What about one that's like?
Refrain from delusion.
What's that?
Refrain from delusion, or
Yeah. So avoid delusion, either like self-delusion, right?
yeah.
How about somebody else pulling the wool over your eyes?
Being gullible.
Yeah. So let's see, being. Or was it better word than tricked. Being tricked by politicians, by advertisers, by evangelists, by people that put crazy stuff on the internet, on YouTube and blogs, being taken in by some kooky conspiracy theory, being taken in by pseudoscience, and you get cancer, and you like decide you're going to eat a macrobiotic diet and meditate and make your cancer go away, and then you think, oh, I'm getting pretty sick here. I think I've lost 100 pounds and I only weighed 150 to begin with. And how about some of the chemo? Sorry, too late. It's inoperable. This is essentially what happened to Steve Jobs. And so, these things have real world consequences. It could mean being taken in by like an investment scam and losing your life savings. It could mean being the dupe of some politician. It could mean buying something that based on sort of emotional needs and being prey to advertisers that play to those. So there's a lot. It could mean like finding yourself, join some kooky cult, and there are lots of ways in which a lack of critical thinking can cause trouble in your life. And so, so this class tries to get people to hone those skills of being reflective and thoughtful and asking lots of questions, and to with the goal of like all those things. These are all the negative things that happen to you if you don't think critically. So how would you put it in a positive way? Like what's the goal of critical thinking?
Come to a accurate conclusion.
Yeah, so accurate. So what's another way of saying that? What's it mean for something to be accurate?
Truthful.
Yeah. Truth. So you want truth and let's say...
Avoid contradiction.
and then why are contradictions bad, though?
They lead into lack of trust and opinion and false information prevailing.
Right, these are all true. So it's like basically false beliefs.
Yeah.
So you want to get as many true beliefs as you can and avoid as many false beliefs as you can. And probably you're better off. There's a question actually strategically whether you should err on the side of avoiding the true beliefs, or whether you should let a few false beliefs in if they'll give you more true beliefs, or if the thing you really want to do is avoid the false beliefs.
I mean, only if the false beliefs showed you inconsistencies to prove better, but not so much that these false beliefs aid in advancing my true belief, unless it showed me where I erred and corrected the overall belief.
Yeah.
That might be all right, but...
So like if you're thinking about your beliefs, like how high should the bar of proof be, right? So if you put the bar way up here, then you're going to need lots of evidence to convince you that something's true. And the number of things you could say, yes, I believe that belief is true, I know that it's true, are going to be fewer, right? If you lower the bar and believe lots of different things and your standard of proof is really low, you're going to have more true beliefs, but they're also going to be mixed in with more false beliefs, right? So, where does it go? But at least your goal here is getting true beliefs. So what, and knowledge of the true beliefs, which means that the beliefs you have are true, and they're not just sort of true by accident, that your beliefs are true and that you know them to be true. You have evidence for them, you have proof, you have a good argument for them. And so knowledge is basically true, justified belief. So you have a true belief, and then it's a belief that's backed up by evidence. Well, what is it to have a true belief? We were talking about this a bit last time.
True belief corresponds to what reality is.
Yeah, so we talked about a bit about the correspondence theory of truth. So a true statement is one which corresponds with reality, right? So whose reality?
Yeah. The general reality?
Yeah, the reality. So this question, whose reality, I think is in some way it's a misleading question because it assumes that everybody has their own reality. And I'll say sometimes it's hard to get around these sort of these ideas without talking sort of around them. But I would just ask the question, like, why would you think there's more than one reality? Reality typically is just the totality of all that is. You think about, okay, well, maybe there's multiple universes, but that set of multiple universes is the greater reality. So reality is what is. It's what exists, independent of our beliefs or feelings about it, right? So I might have a feeling, I might have a wish about how much money I would like to be in my bank account, right? But that has no bearing whatsoever on how much money in fact is in there. How much money is in there is based on how much money I've earned, how much has been given to me, how much has been deposited in that account, how much interest I've earned, if any, right? Those are the objective facts. And it doesn't matter how much I hope or believe or wish that the number is different, the number is what it is, because whatever number that is what is. So truth is that which corresponds with reality, but correspondence with reality. And this is in the covered in the handout in Moodle, so you haven't looked at that already. You should look in week 1. We have I had several readings. I had one about the correspondence theory of truth, one about the double slit experiment, and one about the water thing that you brought up. So truth is corresponds with reality. So a true statement, truth is a quality, and it's a quality which applies to, say, propositions. I might just talk about beliefs in this class. I go back and forth between beliefs and propositions. A proposition is the true false thing. And the idea is that any declarative statement, any meaningful, well-clarified declarative statement is either true or false. And we're talking about this last time, the law of excluded middle. So let me get another page here. Any meaningful well qualified and defined statement. A statement is an expression of a proposition, either verbally or written. The proposition is the true false thing. So any meaningful, well-qualified, and defined statement is either true or false. So let me take some examples here. Let's see. Do you think about this? What is the capital of Syria? True or false? This neither one, right? Why can't it be true or false? Yeah.
It's not a well-qualified, defined statement, it's a question.
Yeah, it's a question. So the difference between a question and a statement. Now, a question might elicit a statement. You know, does anyone know what the answer is? Off the bridge with you into the chasm. You see Monty Python, the Holy Grail. That's the question that sends sends Tim into the pit. Anyway, it's Nineveh, right? So if I said Nineveh is the capital of Assyria, then that would work just fine. And I suppose you could say, well, Syria's Syrian Empire no longer exists, and that might be an issue. So how about this one? True or false? See, you might say, yeah, go Ducks. You might, I suppose, agree with it. But is this really a statement about the world? Is it reflecting some reality?
Just a desire.
Yeah, it's like you're expressing an emotional attitude, right? It's not about the world. It's about you, I guess, and about what they want the Ducks to win their next game, right? So that's, again, it's an interrogative. It's an expression of emotion. It's not a statement. Right? Same thing here, right? You say tell someone to go away. It's not a statement. How about this one? This one is similar. The present king of France is bald. Yeah, you know where I'm going here. So what about this one? It seems like it's a declarative statement, right? Is it true or false?
False in the real world because there's no king of France, but true if this mythical king is bald.
It's kind of weird because there is no present king of France, so it's sort of based on a.
False statement.
It's based on a false state. So there's no referent in this thing. There's nothing that this refers to. So that you're taking a thing that doesn't exist and attributing a property to it. So a lot of philosophers will say that this statement is neither true nor false. It's meaningless because you're attributing a property to a thing that doesn't exist. There's no, and it's not just that he's a fictional character or something, but he doesn't exist at all. There's no referent because there's no present king of France.
Snow is white.
I've been listening to Sherlock Holmes radio shows again. The Nigel Bruce, Basil Rathbone ones are the great ones. The John Stanley's all right. I'm not as big on the other Watson, although he's growing on me. I can't even remember his name, but Sherlock Holmes lives at 221B Baker Street. I knew I'd run out of room. So, it's true or false? Sherlock Holmes lives at 221B Baker Street. Some people, I would say true. Now, the thing is, Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, right? But Sherlock Holmes exists as a fictional character, right? So, in the Sherlock Holmes canon, that's actually where he lives. He rents a room from Mrs. Hudson at 221B Baker Street with Mr. Watson, who's his roommate. Right, or Sherlock Holmes' partner, John Watson, is a medical doctor. That would be true, right? So those simple declarative statements. So there's some kind of funny ones, funny cases, but you take the statement like, the cat is on the mat, or maybe I'll have like, what's a simple declarative statement?
Snow is white.
Snow is white. The U.S. debt, federal debt, will qualify it. Sometimes your language is vague, and that can be a problem. Has surpassed. Anybody know what it is now?
Isn't it past 14?
Way past 14.
It's like maybe 20 now, maybe.
Yep. 20 trillion. TN, I don't know what the abbreviation is. That's true, right? So, or I could have, what? How about the Vegas shooter was a Muslim? As far as we know, false. ISIS has claimed that there was a big attack on outdoor country music concert in Vegas on the Strip. Like 50 people are dead and over 50 the body count keeps on going up. 500 people were injured. So the shooter, it doesn't look like a terrorist attack, but the details are coming out. But right now, I'd say, the details might be sketchy, but now, even though I'm not sure whether, like ISIS said he was a recent convert, and ISIS had targeted the Strip, and ISIS usually doesn't claim responsibility for things just willy-nilly, so maybe it turns out he was a Muslim convert. But either it'll turn out that he was or he wasn't, right? Or it might be, I suppose, we don't know, but it seems like, given the ability to gather evidence, that you would know one way or the other. So that would be something to either it's true or false, and maybe our best guess right now is something, but is that he wasn't, but we don't know yet. The question again is how much evidence you need. I'd say like one thing when you have like unfolding news events, it's important to keep in mind that early details are often wrong. Everybody's racing to get the scoop, and so you could be a little cautious about what you'll accept as true. But all these things are I know how many, add one more here. What do you think? Is that a well qualified, meaningful statement?
Not everybody believes in God or his existence.
So maybe it's false.
It's not really.
Can't prove it either way.
Disprove it either, yeah.
Does the fact that it can't be proven show that it's not either true or false? Like, are there other things that we can't prove that we think either have to be true or they have to be false? Well, how about like there's a 54th moon revolving around Jupiter that has an orbit, an irregular orbit, such that it's not visible, or it's small enough that our telescopes can't pick it up or something, right? It seems like it's the number of moons around Jupiter, given a definition of moon, it's either it's one number, right? Now I think it's 53. So now before we had telescopes good enough to see the moons of Jupiter, there were still 53 moons there. We just couldn't prove it. Even the planet Pluto wasn't discovered till like 1929 or something, right? It's the ninth planet out, and it's been demoted to like a dwarf planet, and then the astronomers are arguing about the definition of a planet, right? But there's been a ball of mostly ice with some rock mixed in, floating out there, in a semi-regular orbit in the solar system, before there were even human beings, right? It was still out there. So it's true that there's a ninth planet, given standard definition of planet, or that it's true there's a ball of ice and rock orbiting around the sun, right? That would be true. So I'll just put Pluto. Pluto exists, or something like that, or there are Pluto's reclassified as a planet, or what the deal is. I haven't been up on astronomy. It is a planet now?
Yeah, they're trying to change it back.
There are 9 planets. So then notice that what really changed wasn't like the facts of reality. What changed was our classification system, right? So there, you're not really dealing with, it's not like it's relative whether Pluto exists or not, but it might be relative to our interpretive schema, whether Pluto counts as a planet or not. But the fact that there's this ball of rock and ice out there is not something that's dependent on our beliefs about it, right? Or whether we can see it, whether we have telescopes, or even whether we're even here. It's there. Even if we're not here, it's always been there, or at least it's been there since the early formation of the solar system. So there are 9 planets in the solar system. So all these are either true or false. So that's the law of excluded middle. Did I stick that up there? So that's what this, I'll just put this here. The law of excluded middle. So what's the middle here? What's the middle that we're excluding? Well, the idea there's some middle ground between true and false. Kind of true, kind of false, I don't know. And again, you get these kind of weird cases where you have like a sentence that refers to something that doesn't exist. I mean, you could say the capital of Assyria, it's assumed like when the Assyrian Empire existed. It's like saying, what would be an example? With some past historical thing. Well, you could say what was the capital of Assyria, I guess, if you wanted to be proper. But it's, context. So there is a certain amount of vagueness in language. You get these weird cases that you could just sort of rule out, and you say, well, okay, there are these funny cases about, say, a sentence that has a subject that doesn't exist, that refers to something that does exist, but you think, well, what about the God case? If you think that God doesn't exist. But there's something weird about the present king of France, because we all know there isn't a present king of France, and it's sort of intentionally referring to something that doesn't exist and is known not to exist. Whereas that maybe God's more in dispute. Anyway, all these are declarative statements, and these are all things that are going to be premises in our argument. So, let's see. So, but getting back to the true or false. So we're starting out with truth is objective. It's the way the world is, and that the truth is not the same as belief. Or appearance, like the way things seem. I'm trying to think of what else we could say here. Now, what about people that use this phrase? True for you. True for me. You ever heard anybody use this? Well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me. Or, oh, that's your reality, or in his reality, blah, blah. Your reality and my reality. In Professor Borrowdale's world, fill in the blank. What would be included in my world? No one would leave the overhead projector on all night and run down the bulb. But the idea is that we don't literally have our own individual realities, that we live in a shared reality. So this is like the basis of all rational thought. So if you ask a question, why do you ask questions? Yeah, you want answers. What is an answer?
Factual statement about reality?
Yeah, answers are the facts of reality. You're not looking to explore your personal beliefs. You're not looking at what people think they're getting. So, like in philosophy, in academic classes, and when you're thinking critically, you're looking to get at the truth. And your truth might not be different than what you believe right now. So let me just hit this, see if there's anything else I say before we move on here. Oh, I don't remember where I put that. middle class here. Oh, they moved it. So there's this other view called relativism. And the relativists think or claim that belief is relative to the individual or to one's culture. So what do you think about that as an idea? This is an alternative to the correspondence theory of truth. This is something you might recognize in like your other classes. People talk about postmodern philosophy, critical theory. And one of the things I find odd is that typically people that espouse these views, they tend to talk out of either side of their mouth. So on the one hand, they'll tell you all of history can be interpreted in terms of class struggle or something, or we live in I don't know, a Eurocentric patriarchal system of white supremacy, and then on the other hand they'll say, hey, but all truth is relative. Like if you make an objection and you say, well here's some evidence against your view, and they'll say, oh, truth's all relative anyway. But let's just take this at face value, this idea that truth is relative to the individual or to society at large. Can you think of any counterexamples to that? If I say, well, what I believe is true for me. You ever say you get in an argument with someone and they'll say, okay, well, you're entitled to your beliefs, but what I believe is true for me. What does that even mean?
Means the truth doesn't matter. They're going to believe what they want to believe.
Yeah, I suppose that's it. I suppose intentionally that's probably what it means, right? Yeah. I think people talk in a loose way. They say, when they say, well, I believe what's true for me means that I want to hold on to my beliefs and I don't want to be argued out of them. But sometimes people talk about this true for you, true for me. They're just talking about people have different beliefs. And maybe there's this idea you shouldn't try to like be boorish or rude in trying to shove your beliefs down somebody else's throat, which I suppose is a fair way to look at things. If you define truth as what an individual believes, it just kind of muddies the waters. I think you're misusing the word truth. And if what you really mean is, well, I believe something, but reality may be otherwise, then you should say that. You shouldn't say, well, it's true for me. Or if by true for me you mean I really believe it, or I believe it really strongly, say that. And that way we can have a discussion about, well, okay, is truth relative to the individual, or is there an objective truth? And I think to ask the question, is truth relative, is to assume the answer that it's not, right? Because why do you ask a question? Well, you want an answer. What's an answer? Well, an answer tells you how it is. So how is it? Well, it can't be that all truth is relative if there's any determinate answer, because your question is truth relative. You have to ask, well, for who, right? Because you can't have like a broad theory of truth such that truth is relative or truth is absolute. If truth is relative, then the only answer you can say is, well, to me it is, which seems to me to be a dead end street. So the same thing, why? So if you're let me ask this question. I asked this last time. Is it possible to have a false belief?
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah, so that means that your belief doesn't determine reality. So then if your individual belief doesn't determine reality, why would you expect it's just like, if there are 10 people who had the same belief you did, that reality would mold itself to fit your preconceptions? Yeah.
With that, so is there I'm honestly curious, do you think that there is a line between what is reality in terms of morality? Like, do you think that there is a line in our morals where we draw it in the sand that creates something wrong, or like something that's wrong or right?
Morality is a tough thing, because it's sort of, we live in it every day, we make moral judgments, but then, to show the reality of which it corresponds can be a difficult thing.
Well, it's like, I think about even on like a cultural level and on our personal lives, and even on like a legal level, like think about pedophilia,
Right, yeah.
100 years ago or however long ago, that was very, very normal. What we would consider completely out of this world and totally wrong, we now culturally accept as a right, or culturally accept as wrong. Sorry, I mixed those up in my brain. But I'm just curious, like, when it comes into and starts playing into people's cultures, is there a defined line between what is wrong and what is right, or is that cultural relativism?
You might say that people's attitudes towards things can change, but for example, you might, let's go back to like the Nazi culture, right? The Nazis were a determinate culture in World War II era, and they, believed in racism and militarism and authoritarianism, right? If you were a Nazi and the majority of people support those views, would that make it right? Would be the question I would ask. I would say no. That even if you get a whole group of people with reprehensible views, that doesn't give them legitimacy. And you might think about it this way: if one person believes a certain thing and that doesn't legitimize it, why would having like 3 million people believe the same thing legitimize it just by sheer numbers? It seems odd that what makes a belief true is it corresponds with reality.
But I mean, in reality, sorry, going back to my example, because that's just where I feel more comfortable like talking in it. Like, in reality, women are able to get pregnant and have children at 13. So ideally, that's, at that point, that's when you're most fertile. That's when, your body's changing and ready to have that experience. But we call it pedophilia. I'm not advocating for pedophilia, but like, that's a cultural thing where a lot of people believe in the same thing. We've all defined it as wrong, and we've made laws as a society to prevent it. Based on...
Yeah. I think the experience of just reality can be relative, just because there's so many different forms of information you can take on millions of different topics, and that can mold somebody's view of what the world really is, even if it isn't actually the case. But they're so forged into that way of thinking that there's no way of like exiting that, because all of their beliefs build up on each other. So you're basically telling them that the reality isn't real, it's relative, but if you come back with a different reality, they can come back with the same argument that, well, my reality is real. You have to deal with all these other things, and I have to deal with these other things, and that's what kind of, I think, can make people hate each other.
But can't that just be people being super entrenched in their beliefs, though?
Yeah, but I mean,
even if
how far does it go until where it's like, they truly believe that's a reality. If someone has a belief in something, they think that is their reality.
But if I believe like super, super hard that my belief is true, doesn't make it true, though. Like, if I believe...
No.
Yeah.
I'm saying, but like, I don't know, it's...
Coming back to my bank account, it doesn't matter how feverishly I desire to, have a vault full of gold, it won't exist, even if I believe it does.
It's just hard to it's hard, I'm having a difficult time applying this concept to real life issues.
Yeah.
Like, when I'm looking at actual things that are happening in our society, it isn't about hard numbers. It's about whether or not gay marriage is all right, and there isn't a hard truth, so how do you have that? How do you have a hard reality when we haven't decided, I guess, what reality looks like for us?
So there's two points. One is that morality is like a special problem. So just put that aside for a moment. Another is like any precondition to having an actual intellectual discourse about what is the case or what is true, or even what policy is best, like for government recognition of gay marriage, for example, is predicated on this idea we live in a shared reality and we have rules of evidence, and we're going to try to make logical arguments and fairly listen to the other side and try to come to some logical conclusion instead of thinking with our feelings and emotions and being irrational about it. And there's a lot of irrationality about that and lots of other controversial social issues. And even, the pedophilia thing, I think you make a good point about, what counts as pedophilia. And it certainly is the case that even in some states, the age of consent, I think in Delaware, it's like, used to be 13, maybe they jacked up to 14 or 15. So, over in Europe, it's much less. And there, I think it's important to be aware that our feelings are in part molded by our culture. But philosophically, you might ask in the abstract, well, why do we have these laws? What are these attitudes that people have based on? Instead of just looking at the attitudes themselves, look at like, well, what's the argument or the evidence say that early marriage is harmful, or that sex at an early age is harmful, or that a difference in ages that's a certain amount is harmful, and so on. You might look at like empirical research in the social sciences about like the effects of molestation by parents or family members typically, or friends of the family and neighbors, that has a traumatic effect on children, independent of what the culture. Part of that is cultural non-acceptance, but part of it is just something when you experience an event, when you experience something that you can't consent to at a very early age, that can cause trouble. So like the evidence for let's say pre-adolescent molestation by an authority figure, lots of evidence that that's really harmful to people. So that would be a reason to stigmatize it and why it's wrong. The case of like the 13 is sort of like that's a really is kind of a borderline case. And then you look at Europe, 15 or 16, it seems like there's no problem with that at all, and it's sort of there's no bad things associated with them. They actually have less what do you call it? So we're talking about legal policy too, but they have less problems with unwanted pregnancies in Europe than they do even in the U.S. Partly because it's expected that kids start having sex at age 15 and 16, and that they should take precautions, where in America it's like just say no till you're 18, which is totally unrealistic, and then people end up not taking precautions because it's kind of giving into impulses as opposed to something that's done more deliberately.
Is that just cultural immaturity over another one?
I mean, part of the picture is that people used to mature earlier. More was expected of people earlier. They're in school less often. People live less long. So there's lots of different factors that affect those attitudes. But I think you can step outside of that and think philosophically, like what's the best situation for human beings, or can we make some generalization about what's traumatic, what's a violation of rights, when a person can consent to things, and so on. Yeah.
I was going to say, so the first thing you said, could you say that morals and reality are not two very different things? Because for a lot longer than it's been pedophilia, it's been perfectly acceptable for 13-year-olds to get married and have babies. Like Allan Poe married his 13-year-old cousin. Nowadays, that's like super taboo.
Mm-hmm.
But morals change, and like you said, morals are a cultural relativism. I think that's more accurate and doesn't really have anything to do with whatever reality is. Like, sure, it's realistic that they can have babies at that age, and it's also realistic that maybe they're not physically done growing at that age and that they should wait a few more years, which is a thinking now.
Yeah, I guess you might not just make it.
But
even if you get pregnant at 13, it's not a guaranteed shot that you will have a successful pregnancy.
Yeah, I'm just saying in terms of like, both things are technically true and are reality, but that has nothing to do with our morals and interpretations. Like,
was the former true before they understood biology better, though, or after?
The former,
before they started understanding how does the pregnancy affect the juvenile or the adult differently, and maybe that information helped the cultural change. So it's more like an introduction of facts versus just like a desire. You know, I mean, they had a basic information. She's flowered now, so like she seems biologically fit, but we realized later on that it's not always biologically fit until she's.
Well, yeah, and the thought wasn't necessarily that she's biologically fit to have the best results. It's that she can, and that's, you know, still a
Can she
true.
though? That's still, that is
So probably not a
circumstantial
good
per person.
idea, like you're right, but still, that's the truth that they were looking at. But again, also, that's just our interpretation of the truth, and we interpret it differently as time goes on, and
I don't know,
that's
I
why
think,
things change.
I think as a culture, that's the only reason why bad and good exists. Like if culture didn't exist, and if emotion didn't exist, then you could practically do anything. Like, I don't know, I'm sure there's some tribes where it's perfectly okay to kill somebody under certain circumstances.
Sure.
But here, you know, it's like, that would be unthinkable.
Our tribe.
Yeah. It's,
Self-defense or something, yeah.
I don't know, I feel like culture kind of dictates whether something is evil or not, and that's why culture's changed with, you know, molestation and whatnot.
Well, certainly, like empirically, you can say the attitudes change, right? The attitudes change. But attitudes change in Germany, so is it relative whether it's okay to be a Nazi or not? Is morality just a social construction? But to ask this question is to assume the corresponds theory of reality. So there's a bunch of different choices, right? There's either there is such a thing as morality, it's legitimate, it's part, you know, and then the question about what is it, is it, and there's lots of different answers for it, for what morality is. And there's lots of different theories about what morality is that are realist theories that assume morality is independent of culture. So you get egoism, deontology, utilitarianism, virtue ethics. There's lots of different things to choose from. And all those views say that morality is independent from the morality exists and it's independent from culture. But to ask that question, well, is morality culturally relative, is to assume the corresponds theory of truth, because either it is or it isn't, right? So but you might make a caveat where you might say, okay, well, morality is a special thing that's just, as you said, a product of culture. And if that's true, then maybe you could make the case for morality being a product of culture. In which case you might say that it's relative. It doesn't mean the corresponds theory goes out the window. It just means that morality isn't like a real objective thing. It's this sort of, thing that we construct. But that's different than how many moons Jupiter has, or whether the cat is on the mat, which have to do with facts of objective reality. It would just turn out that ethics is really a cultural construct and not really part of the fabric of reality. Let's see a bunch of hands there. Actually, hold those thoughts. Let's take our break and we'll come back in 10 minutes and talk about this some more. So there are three people that wanted to talk. Go ahead. You haven't said anything for a while.
So I was wondering if you would touch briefly upon point of view with the assumption that there is only one true reality. However, with point of view, I was wondering if you would make a statement about that. So, we see visible light, the visible light spectrum. If there was theoretically an individual that could see the infrared light spectrum, reality would still be the same. However, their perception of what they would be perceiving would be different.
Yeah, I would say that if you think about sensation, we do part of the way we're aware of the world is through the senses, and we only pick up a narrow spectrum of the electromagnetic, or a narrow swaths of the wavelength of the electromagnetic spectrum. That's true. And color vision is usually brought up as an example of this. Like, are things really red or blue? And John Locke has this idea that, well, these are they're not real properties, they're sort of a facet of human perception. So certain objects absorb all the wavelengths of light except for the one that they reflect into our eyes. And then there's this equipment in our brain that interprets that wavelength as a certain color. And so it creates blue sensations or red sensations in us. So in a way, the object's not really red or blue, it's just creating those sensations in us. But it does have things like a molecular structure, a certain surface structure that absorbs some wavelengths of light and not others, and so on and so forth. So I think, objective worldview would say, well, it's objectively true that human beings can only see certain spectrums of light. It's objectively true that some people are colorblind and either can't see color at all, they just see shades of gray, or they have problems distinguishing, say, between red and green, I think, is the distinction. That sometimes people have trouble distinguishing between those colors. And then certain animals, right, have color perception and some don't. So even though things may appear differently as far as your sensations, there's still an objective worldview, and as long as you have some senses, even a blind person has access to the objective world through hearing and through touch. And it's part of, I say, the scientific worldview that human beings have perceptual equipment that puts us in touch with reality and does it in kind of this indirect way that we take into account when we're thinking about how we understand the world. Go ahead.
I feel like so far with the discussion, we've been kind of leading towards that morality is circumstantial to the moment. How do we find a way to stop drawing lines and shifting sands? Or how do we learn to better keep these lines straight when the sand shifts?
I'd say, it's an open intellectual question about whether morality is objective or whether it's merely a social construct. I have my own ideas about it, but let me, for the purpose of this class, we're talking about the ethics class you just added, and that's like the ethics class, so we deal with that in detail. For the purpose of this class, I'll just say that to ask the question whether morality is real, whether it's an actual facet of reality, whether it has legitimacy and binding force in the individual, whether there's such thing as obligation, or whether you ought to live up to your obligations, say, or whether there's such a thing as moral responsibility, or whether morality is just a social construct and there's nothing to it, and it has no legitimacy, and it's interesting to study, but it doesn't have any binding force in the individual. Those are like two mutually exclusive choices. To ask the question whether it's one or the other is to assume the objective worldview. All right, so either you would say, and so if it's objectively true that morality is a social construct, and it's objectively true that there are different cultures, then there are different moralities. That doesn't mean that reality is relative. It just means that that our understanding of morality is that it's culturally dependent. Since there are different cultures, there are different moralities. That would just square just fine with the objective worldview or the correspondence theory of truth. Here's a question. What's the difference between someone who's a relativist that says truth is in the eye of the beholder and a skeptic that says truth is hard to come by?
The skeptic believes in some kind of ultimate truth. Relativists might not.
Yeah, exactly. So the correspondence theory of truth is something that's compatible with being a skeptic. And although there are extreme skeptics, I would say, having a generally skeptical attitude, will serve you well and is a big part of critical thinking. It's about questioning lots of things and not just taking things on face value. The relativist doesn't believe in the correspondence theory of truth. He has his idea that truth is relative to the individual or to society. And there, maybe you make a case for morality. Again, I think that you can see that if you say morality is culturally relative, what you really mean is that morality is a part of culture, and there are different cultures, and therefore there are different moralities, which is support for an objective worldview. But you think about other things besides morality. If you have like a tribe in the Amazon rainforest that still believes in evil spirits, and they think epilepsy is caused by evil spirits, that doesn't mean it is, right? Or if they believe that taking their picture with a camera steals their soul, it doesn't mean that it does, right? So just because a society believes certain things doesn't make it true. So relativism, this idea that there is no objective truth, that X is true, just means I believe X. But skepticism says no, there is such a thing as objective truth. It's just really hard to come by. Let's see. Just this point about if you say truth is relative, is this question about what do you mean by that? If you mean truth is relative for me, then that's a fascinating statement about you, but it's not really about the world, so why should I care? Right? So, or if you're saying, no, it's absolutely true that truth is relative, then that seems like it's contradictory. So this is why people say the relativist view is self-contradictory or self-referentially incoherent. Basically, if you assert that relativism is the true view about truth, you're contradicting yourself, right? Because you just said there is no absolute truth, except for this idea that all truth is relative. So this is another problem for relativism. Let me just let's talk a bit about the ethics of belief. So, for the purpose of this class, we're going to assume the correspondence theory of truth. We're going to assume that there is an objective reality. A true statement is one which corresponds with that reality. And that the object of critical thinking is to understand reality, to know the world as it is, as opposed to how we or others might wish it to be. And so then the question is, what are our obligations with regard to thinking critically? So this is, again, jumping right into ethics, I suppose. This is also maybe partly about the importance of critical thinking, but it's about your obligations for forming your beliefs critically and carefully, and not being gullible or taken in by beliefs for which there's little or no evidence. And it's also a question about what you have the right to believe. So I suppose this essay assumes there's certain things of right and wrong, and Clifford is a bit of a moralist, but I think let's assume, just in our prior discussion, that there's some sort of account of morality such that certain things are actually right and wrong. So he has this example of the ship owner. Anybody who's read this remember what the case of the ship owner is? Yeah, go ahead.
So he had some slight doubts about the safety of the ship because of how long it had been in service. But the steps to go through getting the ship checked seemed to be a little over daunting, and so then he began to self-justify that the people who made the ship were honest, they wouldn't defect on anything, and so on and so forth. And so, like, the first attempt was that he decided that he was going to believe that the ship was safe enough to send people onto a voyage, and then the ship sank, and he collected the tax money from it.
Yeah, or I think it's insurance money.
Insurance
But yeah,
money.
so he's no the worse for wear. But everybody died, right? Why? Because so why did everybody die? I remember
It's
what.
false belief.
So his belief was false, but is that why Clifford thinks he's
He
like?
should have investigated. He should have made a decision based on his beliefs only.
Yeah, I think that's Clifford would say the reason why he had his false belief, he didn't investigate, and that what he's done wrong there. Now, let's say that, like, if how many people would say that he's done something wrong? Yeah. So the question is, what did he do wrong? Yeah.
He ignored the people whose job it was to repair the ships, the ones that advised him that it needed repairs, so he ignored that, and he focused on the fact that supported his belief, which was that the ships made plenty of trips and it should be fine if it makes another one. So he chose what to focus on, even though just because one of them supported his belief and the other one was more based on reality.
Yeah.
He had an unjustified belief.
Exactly. So Clifford says, if you have an unjustified belief, you've done something wrong. And what's an unjustified belief?
Belief with no evidence.
Yeah. So this is Clifford. Unjustified beliefs. Are wrong. And these are beliefs, and not just with no evidence, but beliefs without sufficient evidence, which means this idea of having enough evidence to count as knowledge, sufficient evidence. So you can think about, like, there are various degrees of evidence you might have for a belief. And the question is, how much evidence is enough to say that you know that belief? And I think the philosophers will generally say that if you have enough evidence such that a rational person would believe this thing, then that's sort of one criteria. Such that a reasonable person would assent to that belief or accept it as true, then that's sufficient evidence. And we have like a rough idea of like, okay, the idea of insufficient evidence, right? So insufficient evidence would be either no evidence or what might be, so what would be like a small amount of evidence that isn't enough in a particular case? You're trying to make up your mind about something.
I mean, off the ship example would be like, I've checked that the boards aren't rotting away.
Yeah.
And the bindings are still held together. There's no cracks in between the boards. Just that the boards are still unrotted and still.
Yeah, you might look at, like, he looks at the ship and he's like, it looks fine to me, right? Maybe he'd like stare at the boards, and maybe he'd look at the boards that are like above the water line and they all look good. He doesn't go down below and see all the water seeping in. And all the rotted boards, maybe on the very bottom of the boat. It's expensive to take it out of the water and look. Yeah, so there's insufficient evidence. Sometimes you get like the say-so from somebody that you trust, and it turns out they were just going on somebody else's say-so, right? So there's lots of cases where you think, well, that's not really enough evidence. So this Clifford says that you have an obligation for any of your beliefs to believe them with to have sufficient evidence. So he, at the end of the article, he says, to sum up, which lets you know, hey, this is what he's going at. Let's see if we can find it here. To sum up, it is wrong always, anywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. So, and he sort of, Clifford pushes his point with gusto and has a great passion for for having your beliefs justified. So he says, he talks about this idea of having comforting beliefs. And this idea if you allow yourself to sort of fall into pleasant delusions. And he says, by such a course I shall surround myself with a thick atmosphere of falsehood and fraud. And in that I must live. It may matter little to me in my cloud castle of sweet illusions and darling lies, but it matters much to man, with a capital M, humanity, that I have made my neighbors ready to deceive. The credulous man, meaning the gullible person, the person who will believe anything. The credulous man is the father to the liar and the cheat. He lives in the bosom of his family, and it is no marvel that he should become as they are. So closely are our duties knit together that whoso shall keep the whole of the law and yet offend at one point is guilty of all. So this is a quote from the Bible. It's kind of funny, coming from Clifford, who was kind of a skeptic. But he has this idea that we live in community, and your unjustified beliefs, you're kind of like Typhoid Mary, serving up the soup, giving your disease to all the people you're serving. That beliefs are not a private matter; they're a public matter, and people tend to spread them around. And he says that you have an obligation to form your beliefs carefully, not just for your own good, but for the good of society. What do you think about that idea? Like it?
It almost seems like that the majority of our actions aren't exactly private.
Yeah, it seems like you do things in public.
It's like, if I'm doing something in private that is inconsistent with the overall truth of man, I'm still wrong in my existence to that degree, so long as I'm perpetuating that belief. So it's like, if I'm not open about those actions, nobody can help me criticize and change those actions. So I'm just Typhoid and Mary everything around, so long as I'm doing things in the dark. So it almost feels like it's overly transparent in our society. It would definitely force a transparency to make sure that we're not being these contagious, credulous people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you had your hand up?
I was going to say I liked it, that I thought it was more like a butterfly effect than a Typhoid Mary. Like, we all do little things in our lives that end up affecting the whole of society later on down the line. The man is credulous, then he becomes a father, and then he raises the child, the kid becomes a fraud and a liar, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's good to have, I think, especially like obnoxious people on the internet, investigating things that people do. There's some story about a guy with like one of those sort of two-level haircuts where he that's sort of long on the top and short on the bottom, and he claimed that someone called him a Nazi and stabbed him, and I read the story. It's in some blog that I follow, and there's a picture of the guy that he's got of his blood on his hand, and I'm like, oh, and there's the political climate that we're in. There's been other cases of people being assaulted in the street because they're wearing that red MAGA hat, right? So I'm like, okay. So I oh, this is kind of outrageous. I was like, that's interesting. I click the retweet button, and it turns out the guy accidentally stabbed himself and told the police. The police came up on him and saw him bleeding there, and I guess to not get in trouble or not to look stupid, he made up the story, and it turned out that none of it was true. And, people of all political persuasions make stuff up, right? But I hit that retweet button, without checking it out. I had egg on my face. That was humiliating. Usually I'm super careful about stuff like that, but late at night in a moment of weakness, I retweeted. So be careful about what you retweet. Now, on the other hand, I have a friend that just sends me all these wacky conspiracies, and it's all, Obama's a Muslim, and I'm just thinking of all the stuff, one after the other, and I'd send her to Snopes or send her some other disconfirming information, and every time, and she's like, oh, I'm sorry, I won't send you this anymore. And then she just keeps on sending stuff out and sharing it over and over again. I'm like, can you just like Google it, like put it in Google and see what comes up before you send it to me? And I had to get kind of rude and say, you know, don't you find this humiliating? That and I had to get kind of insulting and try to like shame her, and it didn't seem to work either. So I don't know. But at least, you know, for your own self-respect, you want to have true beliefs and not spread a bunch of falsehoods around. It seems to me, and
It seems so difficult to find true truth these days. Though. It seems impossible.
It is tough, you know, fake news and
There's
news
always
news
just
and fake
something
news,
that was incorrectly placed in anything that's true these days. At least it seems like.
Even when there is like a bit of actual real reporting,
Yeah.
there's been so much fake news around it that's everyone's go-to argument.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's just the media.
Yeah.
It's like you can't prove anything, even if it did happen.
Yeah.
Like,
No, I didn't know.
I saw something where some guy, and even like photographs of some guy, like he took a picture of he took a video still from the presidential debate, the Republican presidential debate, and actually photoshopped Trump's arm, which was over his chest, like doing the pledge, and put it down on his side. Right, this is a Photoshop fake. Somebody else went and corrected it and found the original clip, and you know, and posted and showed this as a fake. But you know, how many people saw like the correction, right? Like Mark Twain said, a lie gets like halfway around the world before the truth even gets up in the morning. So, and you get so it is tough. And we'll have a whole section on critically thinking about the news and politics later in the term. So it should be a lot of fun. But thinking in the abstract about like your duties with regard to forming your beliefs. And people don't generally think about their beliefs in forms of duties. They think about, well, you know, what are the beliefs I've had since I was a child, or what beliefs give me comfort, or what beliefs do all my friends have? And they tend not to think in terms of like their duties to be really careful about the ways in which they form their beliefs. They tend to be based on family background, upbringing, emotional attitudes, and so on. Yeah.
Do you think the only way that you can get a true belief is by having zero emotion? That's the only way to perceive true reality, is have zero emotion to literally everything.
I don't know about that, because even though emotions are a bit subjective, like, we could probably define why we have each emotion,
Yeah.
keep it from being such a transitory feeling and overly circumstantial. Like, you're gonna hate or fear or be angry at anything that threatens your survival to a certain degree or another. So it's
But could that play a role in culture, though? Because, I mean, emotions are why culture builds rules. People feel sad if someone gets killed. But if there was zero emotion, then, yeah, exactly, some people. But it's like, if all of society had zero emotion, how would that play off? Would that be true reality?
Well, I think you make a good point that you know, it's critical thinking, it's not critical feeling, right? So, and often people, when they think with their feelings, they get into trouble. And people, you've probably seen people in politics especially, they react in a sort of visceral manner, or they want to be a part of the group, or so, or they have some like self-interested reason for wanting a certain thing to be true. And so that gets in the way of getting into the actual truth. Right, so I'd say like you can still have those feelings, but you got to be aware of them and be aware of your own biases. Yeah. And once you're aware of those own biases, you can kind of check yourself, and you can say, oh well, don't like jump immediately on that thing that fits in with all your pre-existing beliefs, but try to be as skeptical with that thing as you would be with something that went against all your beliefs. But I think that looking at things in a calm, dispassionate, rational way will, and devoid of emotion, at least when you're trying to evaluate it, ask yourself, well, okay, what does this look like? And then you can still have those other feelings and associations. It's just that those have to come second. And the feelings and emotions are good for motivating you to act in your beliefs. But so they need to be sort of a back end thing. They can't be their front end when you're trying to decide what's true.
It's definitely important for society as well.
Yeah, I agree with you.
But the reason for the emotion is still objective.
Well, it's based on it's based on your belief, right? If you think, okay, so there was a guy that got really upset at pedophilia, to bring in your example, right? Pedophilia at a pizza parlor in D.C., right? He thought there was a pedophile ring being run out of like John Podesta's brother's pizza parlor or something. And so he goes there with a gun. He's going to save those kids, by God. And he probably had some really strong emotions about this, right? And then he gets there, and and the police are called, and he ends up being arrested. But I mean, he had really strong emotions. Now he is going based on some crazy internet conspiracy that that there's this pedophilia ring run out of ping pong pizza in a suburb of D.C. But so he had those strong emotions, but they're based on he was thinking with his emotions and bought into a conspiracy theory without sufficient evidence, and ended up basically, I don't know if he ruined his life, but he certainly is a big speed bump in his road of life right now, and he's facing criminal charges and endangered the lives of people based on buying into this crazy theory. And now he realizes that it's a crazy theory and he was totally wrong, and the theory has been debunked, I think, but still there's this idea of acting on impulsive emotions based on insufficient evidence. Now, if he had down with the conspiracy theory, he could still have this feeling like that child molestation is wrong, and maybe he could put that to more constructive use, say by being a part of some activist group that fights against actual like trafficking of children in third world countries or something like that. That would be a more effective way to use his passion for saving the children or something. Let's see, you had your hand up. Somebody had their hand up over here. Okay. I want to just quote a couple of passages here where I think Clifford really brings it home. Let's see. Sometimes people have this idea that, well, it's only like certain beliefs. There's certain beliefs that are public, and there's other beliefs that are private. And I'm entitled to have my pet beliefs about things, and if they're just sort of harmless superstitions or they're my own thing, nobody's gonna know, then who am I really hurting? Really, I listen to George Norrie on the Coast to Coast, and he's talking about ancient aliens or pyramid power or something like that, and it's kind of cool. I think, ooh, what if that was true? Wouldn't that be awesome? And it's kind of fun, and I like doing my horoscope, and I play with the tarot cards, and I'm not sure if I really believe it, but sometimes I think maybe there's something to it. And so the idea is that is it really okay to have sort of these innocuous beliefs? And so here's what he says. He says, no man's belief is in any case a private matter which concerns himself alone. Our lives are guided by the general conception of the course of things, which is created by society for social purposes. Yeah, it sounds like a socialist. I don't know if I like this. Make it down something better. He talks about our beliefs are an heirloom which every succeeding generation inherits as a precious deposit in a sacred trust to be handed on to the next one, not unchanged, but enlarged and purified with some clear marks of its own proper handiwork. And he says it's an awful privilege and an awful responsibility that we help create the world in which posterity will live. Here's the money quote. Belief, that sacred faculty which prompts the decisions of our will and knits into harmonious working all the compact energies of our being, is not for ourselves, but for humanity. It is rightly used on truths which have been established by long experience and waiting toil, and which have stood in the fierce light of free and fearless questioning. Then it helps to bind all men together and to strengthen and direct their common action. It is desecrated when given to unproved and unquestioned statements for the solace and private pleasure of the believer. to add a tinsel splendor to the plain straight road of our life and display a bright mirage beyond it, or even to drown the common sorrows of our kind by a self-deception which allows them not only to cast down but also to degrade us. Whoso would deserve well of his fellows in this matter will guard the purity of his beliefs with a very fanaticism of jealous care, lest at any time they should rest in an unworthy object and catch a stain which can never be wiped away. So Clifford's like really, passionate about forming beliefs on the basis of sufficient evidence and wants you to be too. So what do you think? Does he carry it too far, or is he right that we ought to be fanatics about our beliefs, that we ought to be really super careful about what we will give our assent to?
I think he's right, because like he said, it's our responsibility of each generation to pass the truth on to the next, so we should be very careful what we decide to be true.
There was something kind of degrading about finding out you believe something really foolish, not just like false, but totally ridiculous. And I can think back to my youth of some of the things, beyond Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and so on. Even when I got older, even in graduate school, the things that you think you ought to have known better. And so for those things, I think that he makes this point too. You see a lot of stuff. Why do people believe in crazy conspiracy theories or join kooky cults or have these sort of weird fringy beliefs? And he talks about the tinsel splendor, right? So you think about, well, would it be cool if fill in the blank, right? There are unseen forces at work in the universe. There's like the Illuminati are calling the shots of the shadow government. Or I suppose it's kind of scary, right? But it's kind of cool to think about, and also to think that you have the secret, right? So, because you watch all those YouTube videos, so you know the truth, and now you need to spread to everyone else. And it makes you feel kind of special, right? So it's like part of human nature to want to feel special and to feel like you're sort of part of the elite that knows the secret, that everybody else is the sheeple who are all following, the mainstream narrative, but you have the truth. And it's a terrible truth. Yeah.
You brought up cults being a part of that. What's the difference between that and a religion?
Oh, that's a good question. So later in the course, we're going to talk about critically thinking about religion. A cult generally revolves around a charismatic leader, has a sort of recruiting strategies that separate the members from their families and from society at large sometimes, and use certain mind control techniques of indoctrination. And not to say that some religions don't do some of those things, but there's sort of a cult is maybe in a sociological definition. It intentionally plays on certain facets of human nature to try to lure people in, preys on vulnerable people in life's transitions, and then indoctrinates them into cult beliefs through subterfuge and, what you might call mind control techniques. It's from the old Latin word cultus, and cultus just meant religion. But I would say functionally there's a difference between, say, the Catholic Church and Scientology, for example. Or, the Branch Davidian cult or something like that, where you have people that there's various techniques you can use, or the Jim Jones cult, the People's Temple is another another famous example of people where they use sleep deprivation to cut people off from family members, isolate them, make them sit for like hours and hours listening to sermons. So there's lots of different things they will do. But it's a good question. Maybe we'll talk about that in the section on thinking critically about religion. The other thing is like to think about, everybody has problems, right? And in some ways, believing things which are kind of beyond reality can be a pleasant escape. And so, but it's one thing to like watch a sci-fi or fantasy movie and to escape to another reality, but another to confuse that with like the real world. And here he's saying that you shouldn't indulge in the private pleasure or find solace in the tinsel splendor of false beliefs, even though the real world, Clifford says, is kind of boring, right? Reality might be boring. Science might be boring. It's like, it's more exciting and interesting to think that you have ghosts in your house than to think you got a leaky pipe in the basement, right? So but he says you should be careful about that because your life is going to go better and the life of other people might depend on you being careful about your beliefs. That's all I want to say about Clifford. Let me just kind of sum up things. We're going to get in properly into talking about arguments next time, and what an argument is.
What does Clifford think about justified untrue beliefs?
So there, I think, critical thinking is not a guarantee your beliefs will be true. So having sufficient evidence isn't a guarantee that your beliefs will be true. It's just it's the only game in town, and they're much more likely to be true. So you can still like marshal all the evidence and try to be objective and try not to engage in confirmation bias, which is only counting the things that seem to support your view and dismissing things that don't support your view, right? So there's also things you can do to be biased. But it's not a guarantee you'll get to the truth. Sometimes you could have an unjustified belief, or a justified belief that, you say a justified belief that's untrue? Yeah, so sometimes this happens with like a court case where all the evidence points to the defendant being guilty and it turns out he's innocent. And then later on, they have DNA evidence or something that Annie ends up getting out after serving 20 years and, avoiding the death penalty. So that's just, in the real world, we live in an imperfect world. Evidence doesn't always point us in the direction of the truth, but it's the best chance we got. I think I added some stuff about bias. So there's a couple of problems we talked about for critical thinking. The vagueness of language is one. And then bias is another. Vagueness of language, I think. You recognize that language is imprecise. Language is a shortcut for describing reality. I don't know if you ever talked to someone that goes into excessive detail about everything, and it can be like very frustrating to listen to them. You're like, come on, or you're like, okay, well, I don't. That's all very good, but please tell me the answer to this, and you want like 2 words. So language is vague, like we talked about whether it's raining or not. Okay, to tell whether it's raining or not, you like look out and what do you count as rain? But people have like sort of a vague idea that it's more than fog, and I suppose there's no less than for rain. And then there's different words for rain. It could be a downpour. It could be sprinkling. So, and then, what's the difference between a heavy fog and a light sprinkling, And maybe, maybe there isn't any like clear demarcation. But words are, they're practically useful, and the vagueness of language is what makes it flexible. And so that's a good thing. But when we're trying to think critically, sometimes we want to be really careful about, like, we want to be precise, have precision, and we want to define terms. And this goes back to having like well-qualified, meaningful propositions when we're trying to make an argument. So it's really important to define our terms and to try to be very precise with our language, as they do in the sciences. I think philosophy also, you need to know what you're talking about and to be very precise in your language, so that, and we'll talk about some fallacies that actually rely on vagueness. There's fallacies of vagueness that will actually cause you to go wrong in your arguments, or that people use to try to pull the wool over people's eyes. Yeah, you had your hand up? No? We want to make sure to guard against bias in ourselves and look for it in others. So that'll be an important part of the class. And to try to be fair-minded and when we're engaged in an argument with someone else, to listen to them, to be aware of our own biases and how they might be getting in the way of us having an objective assessment of the truth. So far we've been talking about, we got 2 minutes. Let me just introduce this really quick. Here we have the sort of idea of an argument. And an argument is going to be one or more premises. Which prove a conclusion. So premises are going to be simple declarative statements which purport to describe reality. We have a series of one or more premises, such that those premises logically prove the conclusion. And we'll talk about two kinds of arguments. Inductive arguments, where we have a bunch of premises which are evidence for the conclusion that only give us a certain probability the conclusion is true. Although it may be very high, it's still a matter of probability. And then deductive arguments, which guarantee 100% that the conclusion is true. We'll talk about that you use these arguments in different ways, and even though the deductive argument gives you 100% certainty that if your premises are true, your conclusion is true, there are reasons why you'd only want to use that form of argument in very few cases, and we'll talk about why that's the case next time. So, inductive and deductive arguments next time. See you then.